Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Let's turn now to the Fed. President Trump says he plans to announce a new Fed governor in the coming days after the resignation of Adriana Kugler. Former New York Fed President Bill Dudley writing this morning, quote, "Don't be fooled by the drama. In terms of how the Fed manages the economy, it's mostly a tempest in a teapot." Bill joins us now. All right, Bill, I won't be distracted by all the drama, but there's a lot of noise right now coming out of Washington, D.C. When it comes to who could potentially take this role, do you think this administration wants to put in a shadow Fed chair?
I don't know if that's their intention or not, but obviously the next governor appointment that seems to be on a faster timeline than we thought will be important because that person could end up being the next Fed chair. And so people will pay particular attention to who that person is and what their views are.
So in that case, and I know as you write, Bill, that you did see Waller's desire to succeed Powell and Bowman's thank you to Trump for appointing her as part of the reason behind their dissents. Bill, if I could just push you on that, because many people have looked at this economy and said there are reasons for a cut, and Friday vindicated that with weaker labor market data. Is there an issue where we look at all these dissents and say they are just political, or is there real evidence that perhaps the Fed should be leaning towards a cut?
Well, the Fed is leaning towards a cut. If you go back and look at the June summary of economic projections, everybody sees the path of rates is going downward. It's just a question of magnitude and timing. So the degree of disagreement within in the Fed is actually, I think, dramatically overstated because everybody thinks the next direction of moves is down. Just a question of when to do it and how to manage the inflation risk caused by the higher tariffs.
So, Bill, the direction of dissent or the amount of dissent is overstated. So, too, is the ability for this FOMC to be swayed. What happens, though, if the data becomes less reliable, if a more political figurehead is put in at the BLS? Bill, you've been in the room evaluating this data with colleagues. How does that change in the Fed's evaluation of said data if changes are made at the Bureau of Labor Statistics?
Well, it depends if whether the changes made at the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually result in poor quality data or not. Obviously, if the data, is rigged, then the Federal Reserve is going to have to go to other sources of data. There's a lot more data available now than there was in the past. There's a lot of data that you can scrape off the internet, for example. So I think that obviously we want the BLS data to be excellent quality and trusted. That's very important. And so we have to keep an eye on that. But the idea that the Fed would be sort of unable to conduct monetary policy because the BLS data was corrupt, I don't think that's the case.
Well, going to the BLS data on Friday, now the average 3-month payroll gain went from 150,000 before Friday's release to now just 35,000. Going back to those two dissenters, doesn't Governor Waller have a point? The crack has already emerged. Is the Fed going to be behind the curve?
Well, I think the Fed probably will be behind the curve because the tariffs create so much uncertainty about what's going to dominate, the risk of inflation or the risk of growth. Everyone said the tariffs are going to push up prices and push down economic activity. And the question is, which is going to predominate? So the fact that the Fed might be late is because the tariff policies created this tremendous uncertainty about which force is going to be dominant.
Jay Powell really honed in on the unemployment rate last week, talking about the fact that's the main number he's going to look at. We did see it tick up to 4.2%. What do you think the line is for him where the unemployment rate ticking to what would get him really uncomfortable?
I think, a couple more tenths would definitely get him uncomfortable because then you'd start to think that the whole labor market was starting to give way. And when that happens, it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy because it scares people. They pull back on their spending, and that makes the labor market still weaker. The important point that Powell made, though, is it's not about the payroll employment changes. It's basically how that actually reflects in the unemployment rate. Because what's basically happening this year is the growth rate of labor demand has fallen, but the growth rate of labor supply has also fallen dramatically because of deportations and the crackdown on immigration. So both sides of the labor market are less robust than they were before.
And the jobs that were added, Bill, about 75 of them came from healthcare. The cyclical parts of the economy really were not adding jobs. The lack of breadth in Friday's data, does that concern you at all?
Well, I think, I'm worried that we're going to be in a sort of stagflationary environment where we're going to have both higher prices and a weaker economy. And the question is, which one do you put more weight on? I think the direction of rates is down. I think the question is just, at what meeting does the Fed finally see enough evidence to warrant a cut? As I said in the piece that I published in Bloomberg Opinion, there's not that much disagreement about the Fed. It's all about timing and magnitude. It's not about direction.
Well, what happens if, Bill, we have Adriana Kugler stepping down, so that's certainly a Trump appointment, and then you get Chair Powell, who decides not to stay on as a governor through 2028. In total, you add to that both Bowman and Waller. That means 4 Trump appointees on the FOMC. Does that, in aggregate, just mean, at the very margin, a more dovish shift to this Fed?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, when it's a close call in that kind of situation, the ties are going to go to the doves. But at the end of the day, the economy is going to drive the story. I think, the chairman can't take the Fed wherever he or she wants. It depends on how the economy is motivating what's the right thing to do in terms of monetary policy. The chair has to convince the rest of the FOMC to go along. Now, obviously, if you have 4 governors all lined up on one side, that gives the chair quite a bit of momentum to get his or her way. But, I think the Federal Reserve presidents are going to continue to vote their conscience in terms of what's right for the macroeconomy.
The markets this morning are rebounding off of the lows on Friday, following the fact that everyone's starting to bake in this idea of a September rate cut. But, Bill, what if we get a hot CPI print? What's going to happen then?
Well, I think it's too soon to say that we're going to get a September rate cut. I mean, we just saw how the market for September has moved dramatically just in the last week. When Powell made his remarks at the press conference, people said, "Oh, they're not going to cut in September." And then we got the week in payroll employment report on Friday, and everyone said, "Oh, they are going to cut in September." So it's a long time between now and September. I think the prospects are pretty good that the Fed's going to cut rates later this year. Whether it turns out to be September or not really is going to turn out to depend on the data.
Bill, to what degree could this just be a post-Liberation Day fallout, the jobs data we've had over the past 3 months, and something that might rebound in August, given more certainty on which tariff levels are being set?
I think you're making a good point that the tariffs have caused people to sort of stand back in terms of business hiring and business investment because they don't really know what the landscape is. And as we get past August 1st and hopefully get more clarity on what the tariff packages are going to be country by country, that presumably will make businesses more willing to move forward in terms of their investment and hiring plans. So it certainly could go that way. Or it could go that the higher tariffs are raising prices, that's crimping real income, and that's affecting consumer spending, and that's leading to weakness in employment. That's going to motivate the Fed to cut rates. We still don't know which direction is going to predominate.
What we do know, though, is we know most of the rates. There's a handful of countries potentially could get better deals and better rates. But for the most part, we do know the rates going forward, and they're going to take effect this Thursday. How much time do you think the Fed needs to see this work through the economy?
Well, I think the Fed would like to see, a lot of time, a lot more than, 6 weeks to the next FOMC meeting. I think they think it's probably going to take, 6 months to get to see the full effects of the tariffs, because it takes quite a bit of time between the good landing on U.S. shores and it actually ending up being sold in a department store or other retail establishment. So I think the Fed thinks it's going to be a slow process, and Powell basically said that at his press conference last week.
Former New York Fed President Bill Dudley, thank you so much for your time this morning. And you can catch his opinion piece this morning in Bloomberg Opinion.